Walk the ridge with someone who remembers. An elder in a village east of Lakasi turns a small, glossy pebble in his palm, blue-black and heavy. He calls it the stone that burns blue. His grandfather traded it for salt and cloth, he says, and for a knife that held an edge longer than iron from the coast. He doesn't mention cobalt. He names the smell when it roasts, a sharp sweetness that clings to hair. He says caravans lined that ridge before the rail, long before the white trucks. The ground around him keeps quiet until you scratch it. Where thorn trees thin, scatters of slag glint under dust, glassy vesicular lumps iron dark with tiny green freckles. A meter away, a low mound cradles charcoal flecks and clay nodules shaped like collars, tires the throats where air met fire. Wind lifts ash from inside the mound, blackening fingertips. No plaques, no fences, just a workshop long folded back into the bush. Farther south in the Kafue headwaters, archaeologists lifting soil in shallow squares map stains like ghosts. Circles where hearths burned, streaks where runoff dragged ash downhill, clusters of broken ceramic that match the orifice of bellows pipes. A bead the color of ocean, light turns up in a sieve, translucent soda-lime glass. It doesn't come from here. Traders pushed beads inland from the east coast in waves, the historians say proof of Indian Ocean ties. The bead sits beside a copper awl with hammer marks that match hammers carved into rock art a day's walk away. Rock art isn't a ledger, but it records rhythm. Lines of figures with burdens, a herder with longhorn cattle stepping toward a zigzag that scholars read as a river. One panel shows a girded person holding a long-handled spoon over a shallow pit. People argue about that spoon, grain, beer, or ore. Nearby, a scatter of green-stained stone and a half-moon of slag argue back. There are places where pictures and byproducts hold each other up. Oral histories do their own triangulation. In Bemba, Luba, Lunda, the proverbs loop back to metal. A king who warmed his house with red stone wasn't burning it. He was giving gifts from smelters that ran through the night. Copper crosses show up in graves and shrines, equal-armed and well-balanced, calibrated for hands and backs. They weren't just money. They were weights you could strap to a carrier's pole, units of trust. Along river routes, fishermen swapped dried bream for a finger of worked copper, bright as dawn. Inland, salt made from ash and saline pans traveled with cattle and cloth, meeting ore at predictable places, where old footpaths crossed low saddles in the hills. Those saddles are where isotopes now whisper. The forbidden ratios from certain horizons match soils with black beads of vitrified waste and charcoal older than the missionary diaries that anchor many timelines. The textbook story puts the major copper pulse later, tied neatly to the Bantu expansions that swept south and east with iron, language, and agriculture. Genetic data draws beautiful arcs on maps, coherent and persuasive. But it doesn't forbid pockets of skill that predate the main wave, flickers of technique shared across groups by trade and marriage, igniting smelters on favorable ground. Artifacts care less about blankets we lay over centuries. In a midden outside an old village line, a crucible fragment holds a frozen flow of copper bloom, its underside caked with magnetite slag. A groove on the lip fits a pouring stick. The clay is tempered with crushed grog and plant ash, a recipe that shows up in workshops spread along a north-south axis hugging the ore contact. Those are not random hearths. They're stations in a chain. A story told in Ndola says there was a path you could walk in 4 days if you started with the moon at your shoulder. You could trade blue fire stone for lake salt, then take salt to the coast, then bring beads and cloth back to the hills. The tellers shape time with nights and foot blisters, not rains and treaties. You measure a route by where water sits, where wood is straight, where rock bleeds green when you scrape it with a bone. Genetics brings a quiet check. The Bantu language family spreads with farmers and ironworkers, yes, but local lineages hold patterns that suggest long residency at specific ectones, edges where forests meet savannas, where ore-bearing shales crop out near water. The archaeologists who have spent months drawing pottery profiles at these edges talk about continuity in shard tempers and rim forms that outlast style waves elsewhere. Something held people here. Metal work is a good anchor. Meanwhile, coastal goods leave breadcrumbs. East Coast glass beads with soda-lime signatures thread inland alongside cowries, but so do more humble imports. Tanged knives with ferritic microstructures typical of bloomery iron from older established workshops far to the north and west. In some copperbelt sites, iron and copper rise together in the same layers, but the copper pieces show a confidence. The edges hammered thin, annealed, and rehammered, that comes from long local practice. You don't get that curve in a decade. Here's where the contradiction bites. Museum labels say large-scale, skilled extraction came late, once political centers could command labor. But the slag mounds at the smaller stations are too big for occasional tinkering and too uniform to be experiments. Roasting beds cut into slope, shallow and wide, sit above ore chutes that modern pits now chase. A reheated sample sends off that same sweet metallic note the elder named, the smell that lingers in hair. Copper doesn't lie about heat. A micro-story travels faster than a thesis. In a market near Kapushi, an old man taps a copper cross on a table, dull and heavy. He says his mother's brother carried two like this to the salt pans and returned with a cow and a wife. He smiles. He says the road was safe because it was known men waited at certain trees to swap meat for metal. His grandson sells phone credit beside him, scratching codes when the network allows. Two economies, one habit, roots, trust, exchange. If copper shaped those roots early, then what we call migration flattens into something less tidy and more human. Movement that follows work, stories that follow movement, alliances that follow stories. Power collected not just in capitals but at the mouths of furnaces. And if some of those furnaces left isotope scars in or now feeding batteries and server farms, then the present is literally smelting the past back to life. The 195's chemists didn't have the elders' words, but they touched the same seam. The people and the rock have been in dialogue longer than the maps allow. The forbidden synthesis, copper, cobalt, and an old isotope riddle. Here where the strands knot. Modern labs pulled dusty twins from those old core boxes and matched them against fresh cuttings taken meters away. Cross-lab triangulation, clean as you can make it. Brussels-era numbers on one side, multi-collector mass specs on the other. The Delta 34 stayed light in the same skinny horizon. The lead stayed radiogenic in the same narrow run. Different technicians, different acids, same pairing. The graph didn't just rhyme, it overlaid. That's the psychological pinch. Once you see the overlay, you can't unsee the corridor it marks. Then someone overlaid maps. The odd isotope band traced beneath a hill where slag beads sit in village soils like black hail. Amid a short walk downslope gave up charcoal that dated older than the neat migration chapter headings we teach. Charcoal is fussy but honest. Burn a tree at a furnace, bury the ash, and a laboratory will tell you when that fire licked air. The dates pressed earlier than the tidy models liked. Not Bronze Age fantasies, just enough to ask for a revision. Geochemists hate the word impossible. They prefer pathways. So they built one that fit the fingerprints. Start with ore at or near surface, carrying sulfate from basin life baked into its sulfur. Add people who learn to roast it, slow and shallow, to drive off volatiles and crack sulfides before smelting. Roasting in open beds lets oxygen chew through sulfur, but it also bakes in a signature, light sulfur where bacteria had already tugged at isotopes. Do it in the same place for long enough, and you leave a chemical scar that drills will hit generations later. That's the impossible pathway. Biogenic sulfur married to a later heat history that isn't purely metamorphic. What about the lead? The radiogenic skew needs time or inheritance. The rocks in the belt have both. If early fluids leached a whisper of older lead from basement sources or from detrital grains in the sediments, then parked it in sulfides that later met heat, the lead clock would carry that earlier story. Roasting won't reset it. It isn't hot enough, and lead in sulfides shrugs off short, low-temperature events. So you end up with a horizon where sulfur shouts, "I came through life," and lead mutters, "I've aged longer than this layer." Two clocks, same seam. Skeptics tried to kill it with lab error. They ran blanks, swapped crucibles, dissolved samples in different acid strengths, even shipped splits to labs that compete for contracts. One lab spiked in a tracer to catch contamination. It came back clean. Another reamed the prep room, replaced every beaker, and still got the pairing. Meanwhile, field teams gridded soils above the isotope band and found microslag spheres magnet sticking to a pocket compass. Also in that soil, a drift of green-stained grit that modern rain kept dragging off the same shoulder. The human echo isn't romance, it's logistics. If roasting happened high on slope to catch wind and spare wood, you'd pick the same benches where modern benches now cut trucks' tire marks. You'd need water nearby, draft in a lane the wind loves, and stone you could pile into a bed. The isotope band hugs those benches, and the slag beads march with it. Organized labor leaves tidy messes. Parallel roasting rows, waste dumped consistently downslope, tire collars snapped in the same place when they crack. That consistency shows up in the dirt. Then the cobalt wrinkle. The same anomalous strip that sings with old sulfur and older lead trends into zones that today give up high cobalt without much copper in tow. Carolite clusters like a shadow where copper thins. Battery chemistries argue in press releases, but minds don't read headlines. They feed what's in the ground. The overlap between the forbidden, horizon, and modern cobalt pay streaks isn't perfect, but it's enough to matter. If earlier roasting preferentially altered near-surface copper, or if ancient pickers carried off certain clasts and left others, the residual pattern could bias what enrichment later did. Today's cobalt map remembers yesterday's hands in ways nobody priced. That's where finance starts sweating. If parts of your ore body carry a human time overprint that correlates with cobalt-rich pockets, reserve models built on purely basin plus metamorphism curves undercount both risk and upside. That mispricing flows into offtakes, into hedges, into the capex you thought was covered by acid supply and a stable transformer. And if replication nails down the roasting scar as real, there's a governance twist. Some of the chemical value sits on a layer made by people whose descendants still live on that ridge. Heritage stops being a museum word and starts being a royalty line. Push this synthesis one turn further and it explains behavior. When buyers jostle for long-term cobalt units, they're not just betting on EVs. They're circling a horizon that carries double certainty. Geologic concentration and a traceable, tight footprint you can lock with a few pits and a lot of security. Pair that with isotope baselines and suddenly traceability programs stop being PR and start being maps with teeth. You can prove where a pound came from and who should have a say when it moves. And that's why, after the memos resurfaced and the labs sang in harmony, the scramble stripped off its gloves. The modern scramble, contracts, coups, and choke points. While the isotope graphs lined up in back rooms, the front line moved to maps with colored blocks and acronyms. Concessions overlapped like fingerprints. State licenses, subleases, farm-ins, shadow stakes tucked into subsidiaries in Mauritius and Hong Kong. A copper-cobalt pit near Tank flew 3 flags on paper. The operators, estate companies carried interest, and a silent investor who held a royalty streaming deal that skimmed a sliver off every cathode. In Zambia, a mothballed smelter changed hands twice in a year, each sale framed as stability for lenders who flinched when they heard the word Kolwezi. Meanwhile, the corridor math tightened. The Lobito corridor's 1,289 kilometers to the Atlantic suddenly looked like a lifeline, not a brochure. Ownership wasn't settled by signatures alone. In Kinshasa, a ministry shuffled chairs, rewriting a royalty formula on a Friday evening that tied cobalt payments to a London price plus a strategic premium. In Lusaka, a reformist finance team courted cathode plants with tax holidays and grid guarantees, pushing a narrative: refine at home, ship value, not rock. At the pit, none of that moved waste faster. What did were offtake locks? 5- and 7-year deals where a refiner advanced sulfuric acid, diesel, and cash now for tonnage later. One trader wired a prepayment so big it bought a transformer substation. The contract clause said if power failed, title to ore at the pad transferred at midnight. Logistics veins held all this together until they didn't. Rail east to Dar looked dependable until a port strike stacked containers 3 ships deep. The Lobito corridor west, 289 kilometers to the Atlantic, promised a shorter shot, but crews were still swapping rotten sleepers for steel when the first cobalt convoys rolled, guarded by men with mismatched uniforms and better radios than boots. Road convoys took the beating. Kolwezi to Kasambelsa to Ndola, then down to Durban or Beira, every toll gate a negotiation, every police checkpoint a test of how many photocopies of a waybill you'd printed. Risk found the soft spots. Along a forested stretch north of Likasi, artisanal pits spidered off a legal boundary, feeding sacks into a night market where intermediaries paid in cash and SIM cards. An insurgent cell farther north flared, not to take ground but to tax motion, $1 a sack, $5 a truck. A convoy boss paid 3 tolls in an hour to pass 3 versions of authority. A local chief's cousins, a police unit with badges but no payroll, and men who didn't bother with pretense. He kept receipts. He filed them with a logistics company in Lubumbashi that logged security fees under miscellaneous. Finance turned predatory and protective at once. Western banks, spooked by sanctions risk and NGO reports, pulled back from trade finance that touched gray zones. Chinese policy lenders leaned in, pairing project loans with offtakes that ran to the end of the decade. A Western miner took an ESG loan with interest ratcheting down if audits hit targets for traceability, water recycling, and community spend. Miss a metric and the coupon bumped up. It was moral math with a spreadsheet spine. The CFO grumbled and signed. The treasurer hedged copper on one book and bought cobalt exposure on another, betting chemistries wouldn't flip as fast as headlines. Policy levers made and unmade plans in a week. A draft export ban on concentrates hung over meetings like humidity. Refine at Minehead sounded clean until the acid plant tripped and heaps starved, and every spare ton of sulfur had to be bid for like a lifeboat. A province announced a beneficiation levy that applied retroactively. Permit clerks found their desks covered in forms and visitors. In the same week, a tax holiday for a new Essexio line cleared Parliament in Lusaka, and CapEx raced across a border. Cranes in one valley, mothballed tanks in another. Meanwhile, refineries thousands of kilometers away tightened screws. A Korean cathode plant demanded isotope baselines for inbound cobalt units, numbers on paper tied to GPS coordinates and lab IDs. A Chinese refiner wanted guaranteed run-of-mine feed, regardless of political interference, and wrote a penalty clause that bit if trucks didn't arrive. A European buyer added a community consent annex, vague on thresholds, firm on optics. The miners nodded, then called lawyers. Every clause meant a different risk to insure, a different file to show investors whose money worked only if fear could be priced. Choke points aren't just bridges and borders, they're habits. Acid supply lived on a single plant's uptime. Hydropower lived on lake levels and silted intakes. The Lobedo rails lived on a contractor's ability to keep welders in the bush long enough to stitch joints before rains. A barge on the Lualaba shaved weeks off a route until a sandbar shifted and stranded it by a fishing village that asked, gently, for diesel to pump their wells before the tug came. The barge captain obliged. He filed it as community relations. Coups and near coups sent shocks through slack channels in New York and Shanghai. An army shuffled in a capital. A governor muttered about revisiting contracts. Phones vibrated on trading desks. Spot premiums widened. Juniors' share prices sprang like traps. Majors went quiet, then issued statements about constructive dialogue. On the ground, diggers went to work at dawn because ore under boot pays better than a rumor on a screen. The hidden tension. AI timelines don't pause for politics, neither do penalty clauses. Here's the uncomfortable alignment. The isotope ban everyone argued over ran beneath a cluster of blocks owned by firms with the toughest offtakes and the heaviest private security. A seam with a chemical signature you could pin to a map became a seam with guards you couldn't walk past. That made sense for investors. It made enemies for everyone else. In a week when a refinery wrote a letter about ancestral corridors, a town council wrote another about school roofs that leaked. Both letters referenced the same trucks. And yet, day to day, the scramble held because people kept parts moving. A dispatcher in Ndola paced a container yard and found a chassis nobody had claimed. A customs officer stamped a manifest at 4 p.m. instead of 9 a.m. tomorrow. A driver bribed no one on a stretch where the new commander had decided for a month that bribes made his men look weak. A cell tower stayed up through a storm. Micro-miracles, macro-extractions. All of it pointed to one truth the charts avoided. Contracts don't move ore. Corridors do. And corridors don't exist on paper. They exist in politics, weather, and the willingness of 100 strangers to say yes today. The electricity feedback loop, copper math that hurts. While that scramble played out on the ground, a different drumbeat hammered inside server halls. AI didn't just want power. It wanted power dense, steady, and moved in fat copper veins. A single hyperscale data center swallowed transformers the size of small houses, copper windings stacked like bread loaves, then fed that into switchgear where palm-thick busbars carried current to rows of rectifiers. Every step bled heat. Every fix involved more copper, not less. Walk the aisle where GPU racks hum. Overhead ladder trays sag with bundled cable. Thousands of runs, each a copper artery, each rated for heat that climbs when inference loads spike. Down below, under the raised floor, the old comfort of underrack power died. Too lossy, too hot. So centers rewired, higher voltages to reduce line loss, bigger cross-sections to keep resistive heating down. The fix still spelled copper. Aluminum crept in at the very largest runs, until heat and bend radius pushed it back out. Fire codes nodded to copper because it fails slower. Step outside to the substation. Those gray boxes, oil-filled giants with radiator fins, don't sip copper, they drink it. Windings thick as wrists coil layer after layer. Multiply that by feeds for redundancy because uptime isn't a brag, it's a business. N+1, N+2, every extra path is another buffet of copper. Now scale it to a campus, then to a region chasing AI-ready status. You'll need new lines from generation to load, step-down yards, ring mains. Copper is the throat of all that. Meanwhile, EVs turned roads into moving copper loads. A wiring harness in a standard car already carried tens of pounds. An EV doubles, then adds high-voltage lines sheathed and shielded. Motors chased rare earths, but they're cousins. Battery modules, busbars, battery management systems leaned on copper to keep resistance down and heat predictable. Fast chargers threw a final punch. Megawatt stations with liquid-cooled cables fat as a forearm, copper strands braided and tinned, built to dump electrons hard without melting. Roll out a national charging network, and you find your procurement team arguing with a data center buyer over the same spools. Then the weather got involved. Storm rebuilds aren't optional, they're emergency sprints. Hurricanes and heat waves ripped distribution lines and toasted transformers. Utilities ordered replacements and ran into the same queue as everyone else. There's no just-in-time when an entire county's power is down. You buy what exists at a premium. Substations that should have been refreshed a decade ago found themselves leapfrogged into modern layouts. More copper again. Because pushing more current through older footprints means thicker conductors and better connectors. Price elasticity turned into a joke. Engineers could shave grams at the margin, yes, but physics punishes compromise. Run hotter, lose life. Run thinner, lose efficiency. When loads spiked, so did copper. Procurement lobbied for substitutions. Aluminum took a few wins on long transmission spans and some buswork, then lost on connectors, fatigue, and fire codes. In dense urban systems, weight wasn't the limiter, heat and space were. Copper kept solving. And the hard stat sat behind every slide. Copperbelt ore at ~2, 5% versus ~1, 2% global average is why this ridge sets the tempo for data centers and EVs. Recycling was the promise everyone overquoted. Scrap follows old cycles, it can't lead new ones. The home appliance wave of the 199s doesn't come back to you just because you need copper now. Data centers are too new to scrap. EVs haven't hit end of life in volume. Utilities do reclaim after rebuilds, but disaster scrap arrives dirty, burned, and mixed. Smelters can handle it, but yields drop and timings slip. The lag was structural. You can't melt future clippings.